Philip Obaji Jr. is a Nigeria-based correspondent for the Daily Beast, covering sub-Saharan Africa. He fearlessly and relentlessly uncovers stories about Russian crimes in Africa, including those perpetrated by the Wagner Group. He was awarded International Journalist of the Year in 2023. He won the Future Awards Africa Prize in Education in 2014 and the Future Awards Africa Prize for Young Persons of the Year in 2014. His work is extraordinary. He's given testimony and witness to parliaments in Europe, the US, and many other organizations. The work he does is absolutely extraordinary. It's a huge honor and privilege to be able to welcome him to the channel. Before I get into that, please also do check out his details, subscribe to his channels, but also please check out his fundraising link. The work he does is extraordinary and unique, but it is not cheap. It requires money for the travel, the investigation, and the teams required to produce it. And it's absolutely vital work. So please do check that out in the description of the video. Philip, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's so nice to be with you.
It's a real pleasure. And you know, we're discussing something which, of course, ultimately is very disturbing. That is the influence of Russia, Wagner, perhaps, you know, China as well, because we know China is in some ways, you know, connected with Russia and aligned in certain respects in their strategy, certainly wanting to push the traditional Western powers out of the region. What inspired you to look at this? What did you see? What did you research that made you believe that this was an important topic to dedicate your life to?
It all began in 2018 when 3 Russian journalists traveled to the Central African Republic to investigate the activities of the Russian Wagner Group. And at the time, not many people knew about the Wagner Group. In fact, a lot of people did not even know that Wagner was present in Africa. So sadly, these 3 journalists, after visiting the Wagner base in Bangui, that's the capital of the Central African Republic, they decided to travel up north to see where Wagner paramilitaries had been deployed in the country. That was when they faced, you know, an attack, and were eventually killed in a town called Sibut. So my editor at the Daily Beast at the time, Christopher Dickey, you know, reached out to me and asked that I looked into what happened in the days leading to the death of these journalists, why they went to the Central African Republic, where they went to, who they spoke with, and how they even made their way around the country. So I was based in Nigeria. I'm still actually based in Nigeria, but I started to make phone calls to contacts in the Central African Armed Forces, to friends in the public service, and I was able to understand a little about the Wagner Group. And then some of the people I reached out to also told me about what they knew about these 3 Russian journalists. So I came up with a story, which at the time was one of the most viewed, one of the most read stories on the Daily Beast website for that year. But I discovered that there was a lot more about Russia and its involvement in the Central African Republic. So I took it upon myself, you know, to continue to dig into what the Russians were doing there. And also, more or less, as, you know, a tribute to these journalists to continue from where they stopped, because I felt that they had something very interesting they wanted to find out about the Wagner Group in the country. And I just didn't want that to end, you know, after their death. So that's why I took up the challenge to continue to dig into what the Russians were doing.
And which countries we're principally talking about? Because certainly I'm aware of Mali and, you know, the extensive problems that are happening there. When I was talking to Bivio Chiang, we were talking about a threatened coup in Burkina Faso. But in all, there have been 10 military coups that actually may have gone up since 2019. Do you see, I mean, is it simplistic to say, yes, Wagner's behind all of these? Or are they looking at, you know, existing problems and fractures in society and politics and just trying to take advantage of them?
You're correct about the latter. They're looking at, you know, the problems going on in the country, the crisis, they're looking at the instability, looking at the agitation, more or less, of the people, as we saw in Mali, Burkina Faso, and even in Niger. Well, I did an investigation into the coup in Mali in 2020, and there I discovered that the military officers who led the coup at the time actually had trained in Russia at the start of that year, and then they returned to the country in August, and then they took power. But that's in Mali, and it was even easier for them because there've been lots of protests in Mali, the build up to the coup. A lot of Malians were angry at the high unemployment rates, increase in poverty, economic downturn, and what have you. So that made even the coup a lot easier. But these officers who led the coup had been in Russia on training. Then in Burkina Faso, I wrote a story a month before the coup that the military officers who were involved in the first coup in 2021, they had actually sought the approval of the president to bring in Wagner forces, at least to secure Ouagadougou. But when he refused to do so, no long after, he was toppled. So you could see that there's some bit of Russian connection there. In Niger, the people began to get agitated. Wagner Group had been eyeing Niger for a long time, and even when the military took over, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late founder of the group, was happy about it. He congratulated the military junta that seized power. And they have been carrying out lots of disinformation, talking about the Wagner Group in West Africa, trying to destabilize many areas, trying to truncate democracies and what have you. So it's a lot about the Russian playbook as far as Africa is concerned, yeah.
And of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin was the main character behind Wagner. He was he brought a combination of business understanding and mafia tactics that actually made it rather a successful unit. And of course, he was killed, and a lot of his lieutenants and associates were killed. Did you see any major impact there, or for Wagner was it business as usual in sub-Saharan Africa, even after his death?
Well, Prigozhin had, or let's say the Wagner Group, when Prigozhin was alive, had much more influence in the Central African Republic than anywhere else. And that's where they set up many companies that really they've been using to explore the natural resources of the Central African Republic, which is pretty much in gold and diamond. And under Prigozhin, you could see clearly exactly what they were doing in the sense that you always see new companies, set up in the Central African Republic. The difference now is that we're not seeing, an increase in the Wagner companies that are operating, because it seems as if every year we saw a new company coming into the Central African Republic. That isn't happening that way. But you still have the same people who were in control of things under Prigozhin who are still there right now, even with the Russian Ministry of Defense supervising the affairs of Russian paramilitaries in the Central African Republic. You still have Dmitry Siti, who's in control of operations in the Central African Republic. The Russia House, which is teaching Russian culture, Russian language, bringing Russian anthem into the scheme of things as far as when it comes to the education of children in the Central African Republic schools are concerned. So that is still pretty much ongoing. Nothing much has changed in terms of the operations of the Wagner Group. They are still there in their hundreds. I mean, talking about Wagner paramilitaries, but they like to be called the African Corps in the Central African Republic. So maybe if Prigozhin were to still be alive and running things, would have seen a much bigger expansion in terms of the way they operate. But they're pretty much there, and I don't think they're leaving anytime soon.
Now, all empires we know, and I'm fully aware of speaking about this as a British person, and this always triggers a lot of comments, but all empires have an extractive quality to them. They strip resources from their colonial entities, and the wealth of that does not go back into the local communities. Okay, there's different types of empire, different types of mechanics, but it seems to be fairly common that stripping countries of their resources is a big part of empire and the process there. When it comes to Wagner, or perhaps even China, is there any benefit to the local community or stability that's put back into those economies, or construction of infrastructure, that kind of stuff? Or do they operate in a fairly rapacious manner, taking the resources out and leaving nothing for the local population? Do we know what's going on?
Oh yes, I mean, you can imagine what's going on, because it's pretty much what has been the case in many parts of Africa for decades now. And in the Central African Republic, and also in Mali and the countries where we've seen the Russian paramilitaries, you don't see so much of, well, I say, development in the areas in which they operate. You're right, the Chinese have been doing this for so long in Africa. And the problem is, it always seems as if where the Chinese and where the Russians are, you find a situation where they're either doing things illegally, or they are working in connivance with government officials who are corrupt and will take kickbacks from these, Chinese and Russians. And much of what they do to even evade the state. And with the Russians, that's pretty much what we have seen over the years. In Sudan, we saw under Omar al-Bashir, and even now with the military in control, it's pretty much a very destabilized country. But we've seen, or even read reports where the Russians took gold, as the Wagner Group took gold from areas where they had been mining gold, and then put into aircrafts and fly these aircrafts away from Sudan to Russia or to the Middle East. And that's millions of dollars, if not billions, evading the state. In the Central African Republic, it's even worse, because the Russians have set up companies, they're mining the gold, they're transporting the gold back home, right, and even to the Middle East. And so much is evading the state. But it doesn't stop. What makes it even worse in a country like the Central African Republic is the fact that the local community, or the local communities where this mining takes place, are living in fear. In some areas, the Russians have attacked local artisanal miners because they have the belief that these miners work in collaboration with armed militias, and rebels. So the feeling is that, okay, let's stop the rebels from controlling the gold resources, and then let's take as much as we can out of these communities. So there's nothing going on in these areas. Maybe the difference will be in a community like Bambari, which is near where you have the Ndasima gold mine. The Ndasima gold mine is the only industrialized mine in the Central African Republic. So the Russians have, constructed a long road, so by a kilometer or so, it looks very beautiful now. And before the Russians came, you didn't have a very good road link in Bambari that leads you to Ndasima. So, but that is there now. But you can tell that they did that because it helps them transport the trucks that go into Ndasima and then take this gold and then take them away for processing and what have you. So they're actually not there to develop these areas. They are there to take, they are there to loot. And that's what we've seen. And these days, you see a lot of Chinese miners being arrested by government in parts of Africa, even in Nigeria, because they're either mining illegally, or maybe they're committing some kinds of human rights abuses. So in terms of mining, the mining industry in Central Africa and in West Africa is one of the worst sectors in terms of organization, in terms of corruption, and in terms of human rights abuses, because it seems as if the people who operate in that sector, especially the foreigners who come in, are doing something that is just not right, conniving with local authorities, and then, carrying out all sorts of corrupt, activities. Yeah.
And this is, I think, something that is not that well understood, even by those who look at Russia's actions and go, isn't it terrible, for instance, in Ukraine? The elite in Russia do not want politics to emerge. They don't want any kind of democratic or representative politics. They don't want civic society that they cannot control. They do not want communities to have trust with each other. And this is in Russia itself, because this interferes with the process of extracting resources, getting rich, and then spending it without someone else coming along and taking it away through a legal process. So the entire system is geared up to destroying everything that we would define as, progressive politics, and even a progressive economy where you have, rule of law, flourishing small businesses. Do you see a similar kind of mechanic where Wagner operates in Africa, that they will, collude with, as you say, local militias or even corrupt politicians to try to destroy the practice of journalism, civic society, and anything that could threaten their commercial processes?
We've already seen that happening in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and in the Central African Republic. There's been so much of targeting of journalists in these countries and civil society as well. You have a lot of times I reach out to colleagues in these countries for help in terms of looking into human rights abuses, but then they are scared because they tell me, look, we could get arrested or become targets of either the government or the Russians. And you in the Central African Republic, for example, you can hardly make a distinction between the government and the Russian paramilitaries because they work closely together and they all think alike. In fact, it's even so bad that oftentimes the armed forces in the Central African Republic take orders from the Russian paramilitaries. So everywhere you go, people are so scared of the Russians, and they keep watching you. So you go to Bangui, for example, the capital of the Central African Republic, and if it's glaring that you're a foreigner, especially if you're a Westerner, you look at the Russians following you everywhere. Like you try to go somewhere in your vehicle, you look behind you, you see a Russian vehicle following you, because they're so careful. They really don't want anything going out, to the Western press. And it's the same in Burkina Faso and in Mali. I was in Burkina Faso about a year ago or so, and we could hardly get anything done. I could hardly get anything done because wherever I go, the soldiers are watching. And the Russians there will work hand in hand with this Burkina Faso military. So it is very, very tough to get things done. And the Russians are really focused on getting their goals. It doesn't matter how they achieve it. So before now, when they first came to the Central African Republic, they were going after every single armed person, believing that they belong to either Muslim rebels or Christian, militia groups. But now they are already, giving an olive branch to some of these armed groups. They're asking local rebels to lay down their arms and join the Wagner Group in exchange for training in Russia and monthly stipends. And then now they're using some of these so-called repentance rebels to commit all sorts of havoc, going into mining communities, opening fire at local miners and what have you. So anyone who's interested in working with them, they bring you into the fold, pay you, sometimes maybe not something meaningful, but at least you get paid, and using you to commit all sorts of atrocities. So it's really a problem, and the local communities are suffering this.
And you've documented a lot of this. You've given testimony to this. Not only are there crimes connected to protecting their business interests, but you've also talked very passionately about the crimes just against village communities. That would be murder, rape, torture. Do we know the scale of it? And is this systematic? Wherever Wagner goes, these things appear. Because we see the Russian army in Ukraine. Yeah. Everywhere the Russian army goes, it's a tactical war to rape and kill. It just is. And are you seeing that where they are in sub-Saharan Africa as well?
That's correct. I mean, it's become rape, for example, has become a weapon of war. And I don't know of any community where the Russians have been present where there haven't been any reports of rape. And mind you, it's very difficult to even get these reports out there because people are so scared of talking. And even to me, if I write a story about rape, just know that I have spent weeks, not even months, trying to get to the bottom of this, because people don't want to even talk about this, fear that they will be targeted by the Russians, and even the fear of stigma. So I spend a lot of time working with local contacts in these communities who first of all go and identify these victims, speak with them, and then I come in to do the final interview. So it takes a long time. And sometimes you hear one story or one person in a particular community say, I was raped by the Russians, but it's not enough. I have to be able to corroborate this claim, get more than one person to say the same thing and then get people to confirm that this happens. So oftentimes I don't even get to publish any story about rape in the community because I haven't had many people corroborate the story. Not that I don't believe what this person is saying, but you know how the media works, you have to be able to get people to say, yes, we saw this too. So I don't know of any community where the Russians have been, whether it's in the Central African Republic or in Mali, where we haven't had these stories. So it's real, one big weapon of what they're using. Yeah.
And do we have a sense of the scale of resources or revenue that is being generated? Now, we know that that money will go back to Russia to fund its war machine. Obviously, it will also line people's pockets and pay for the operation, but ultimately it goes back to Russia, and now everything is being burnt up for the war machine. What's the scale of kind of resources that they're getting from multiple countries, or is it very difficult to put an estimate on that?
Well, a few think tanks that have investigated the operations, the commercial operations of the Wagner Group in a number of countries have come up with figures. I think there's one report that says about $2.5 billion worth of gold and diamonds have been taken from the Central African Republic since the Russians got there in 2018. And the other reports that's really say something a little less than that. Yeah, but it's very difficult to get a holistic figure. In Sudan, there have been reports by CNN that says that gold bars were flown out of Sudan in aircrafts. But basically what we've heard, the highest we've heard about how much the Russians have made from Central African Republic is about 2.5 billion US dollars. In Mali, in the beginning, we're told that the Russians were paid $10 million monthly to be present there. But I think it goes beyond that because I'm already hearing from contacts about exploration of gold in southern Mali as we speak. So it's much deeper than we even know. But a few billions have left Africa through Wagner, yeah.
And this is a tricky topic, isn't it? Because Russia has been particularly effective at playing the propagandistic sort of trope that they are anti-imperialist. The US are the bad guys, the British are the bad guys, and let's face it, there are a lot of things that can be said about the crimes of the past, and then the structural and political problems that resulted following decolonization and the taking apart of the British Empire. But they will then use this to pick, to position themselves. We're different from these guys, and yet it seems to me the behavior of Russia it's not like in the Soviet Union where perhaps there was some exchange and some investment in education, and we can question the motives behind that, but they're playing off those relationships with various African countries that were built during the Soviet period, and they position themselves as anti-imperialist, and that their behavior seems to me quintessentially imperialist in its nature. But what's your perspective? What's the perspective across Africa? And does this narrative work in some quarters?
Your analysis, Jonathan, about the Russians being painting a picture of them being anti-imperialist is correct. The sad thing about it is that the message that is being pushed out there, the propaganda, is having huge effects in Africa. There are many Africans now who believe that Russia is the best alternative to Western imperialism, so to speak. And you're seeing the effect of such kinds of propaganda in the Sahel, where the French have been kicked out of virtually everywhere in the Sahel. And there are more people. You go to Togo. I was in Togo a few months ago, and then you hear people on the streets of Togo saying, "We don't want France anymore. Let's try something else. Let's try Russia." Before the coup, I was in Niger, and people were saying, "Let France leave and then let Russia come." You come to Nigeria, my country, you find many people saying, "Well, the West have given us a lot of problems. They've done so much against us in the past." And this whole talk about IMF loans, World Bank loans, and then how the idea behind it is to continue to keep African countries impoverished. And some of these narratives too have been spread by the Russians. So you look at what's going on, and you look at the scale at which this propaganda is going. It's increasing. You have more and more outlets in Africa carrying Russian messages. So that's a problem. And the people on the ground, the people in these countries are buying into this narrative. And that's a real problem. And what the West must do is to support African media to be able to fight these kinds of disinformation and propaganda. But to answer your question, yes, it's having an effect. And the sad thing is that what we're seeing in countries like the Central African Republic and Burkina Faso was seeing neocolonialism by Russia, because you're coming into these countries, you're imposing Russian language in the schools. You're teaching the children Russian anthem, and you're bringing Russian culture to primary schools, not even tertiary schools, but primary. So the people from elementary level are beginning to learn Russian, understand Russian culture, and believing that Russian culture is what will be helpful to them as far as these countries are concerned.
So they're doing the whole, Pushkin thing. They're using literature as a weapon, which they did in Ukraine as well. Suppress local language, create the idea that you've got a primacy of culture, and then you have secondary cultures. That the Russians, I know the answer to this. Will they then look down on local cultures as being primitive or secondary to Russian culture?
Well, Russia is really trying so hard to give the impression that they are the solution to Africa's problems. And that's why they're focused on that in many ways. In security level, the Wagner Group is doing, so much to be at the forefront of the country's effort to get these rebels, to keep these rebels at bay. And then you look at the cultural side, and they may not be saying to the people that your culture is inferior, but when you focus so much on bringing your own culture into the country, people on their own will begin to see your culture, as the Russian culture, has been much more important and even more superior than theirs. And you also know that the white mentality, so to speak, that many Africans have, that what comes from overseas is better than what's obtainable at home. That mentality is huge. So if you continue to bring, to import different stuff from overseas, including culture, at some point the people will be like, well, what you give to us, what you show to us is best. Yeah, so the idea is that in future, maybe the Russian language will become one of, maybe even the official language. Apparently they have that in mind, because already you look at what's happening in the Sahel, a couple of the countries in the Sahel, some of them are already saying, well, French is no longer the official language. So eventually that's the idea, that okay, Russia could be an official language, or if not, maybe one of two official languages. So that's what they're looking at achieving.
It's absolutely extraordinary. And again, because the comments will go crazy going, yes, but what about the British? It's quite clear, that the British brought their culture with them and did a similar process of education and dissemination of culture. So
we're talking about 6 decades ago, and this is under the colonial era. But now you have countries that have become independent for 6 decades, for 5 decades, for 7 decades. And then we're going back to what we saw in the colonial era. That's what's happening now. It's as if that the people of Central African Republic, for example, have never been colonized. It looks like they don't have a democracy. It feels like they don't have control of their own government, because the Russians are coming and dictating the pace.
That's extraordinary, isn't it? Yes, it's a real step backwards, in fact. And we know Russia's not going to invest in progressive society and actually resolve problems. How do you see this developing? Because, of course, Russia is stretched militarily in Ukraine. And we've seen the result of that. They weren't able to support Assad. That regime fell incredibly quickly. could we see a domino effect in Africa if Russian power significantly weakens, or if there's some political collapse, let's say, in Moscow? Or do you think Wagner and the PMCs could carry on working as self-funding, independent elements and continue? Or would they be driven out? But this is, of course, I mean, I'm thinking as Ukrainian here. That's what we want to see, but
that's very possible. Mind you, under Russian law, PMCs are illegal. So it all depends on who's taking, for example, if the Russian war crumbles in Ukraine, let's say Ukraine gains victory, and if Vladimir Putin perhaps loses power in Russia, it depends on who's taking over, you get, and who's going to look at these laws, because what they're doing is illegal under Russian law. But they're all over the place. There are many PMCs now. Now in Africa, you have not just the Wagner Group, you have the Bear Brigade, which is pretty much everywhere in Burkina Faso. And this is to the advantage of not Russia, but the Kremlin. So these PMCs are working to the advantage of the Kremlin. And I don't think that post-Putin, depending on who comes in, I don't think that we will see this whole PMCs spreading everywhere. But it will be a blow to Russia if in the first place they're losing Ukraine. And I see a situation where maybe Moscow will want to bring back some of its PMCs elsewhere to reinforce back home, whatever. But as we speak right now, it makes more sense to Moscow if they keep these paramilitaries where they are, because in some ways, they're using these countries in Africa as training ground. They're also using these countries as areas to also gain resources. Having faced lots of sanctions following its invasion of Ukraine, so it makes more sense now to be able to trade in African gold and diamond resources. So yeah, but even in Syria, they didn't have the manpower and even the military might as they used to have in 2014 and 2015, where they were really propping up the Assad regime. So this time around, they couldn't do so, but they still had troops and vehicles and equipment in Syria. And now they're taking this equipment to Africa, to Libya, and then some of which have been flown to Mali. Some will also end up in the Central African Republic. So maybe they have surplus already in terms of equipment and even in terms of personnel. But I don't think that if Russia continues to lose ground in Ukraine, I don't think that they'll be able to sustain that much of its presence in Africa. Yeah, because it will
that's
be
fascinating. That's something we'll continue to look at. So the last question here really is what direction is your research taking? What projects are you planning, and what impact do you hope to have through your research in the coming year?
Okay, in the past, I focused a lot on the Central African Republic and Mali, but we're seeing an expansion in Russian operations to Burkina Faso. You have the Bear Brigade in the hundreds in Burkina Faso, and then also in Niger, where you have a military government that is so pro-Russia, and where Russia has so-called military instructors in Niger. And but one very important thing I want to look deeply into is the issue of migration, especially as it affects Europe, because in Niger, under the previous government, the EU funding the Nigerian armed forces or the Nigerian security agencies to be able to stem the migrant flow, because what happens, the vast majority of sub-Saharan Africans who seek to travel across the Sahara Desert and across the Mediterranean Sea into Europe, first of all, converge in a town called Agadez in the central part of Niger. And here you find thousands of Africans, who live there. And then every Tuesday, you find hundreds of Africans who get into vehicles and are transported across the Sahara Desert to Libya, from where they get on boats, going towards Europe. But the previous government in Niger actually made sure that they passed a law that criminalized people smuggling, that made it impossible for people to converge in Agadez. But what happened when the military took power? The Russians came in and then were able to convince them to repeal that law. And right now, people smuggling is more or less legal, so to speak, because nobody really holds you accountable or arrest anybody in Agadez for trying to take migrants up north. So I have heard from some people in Agadez that the Russians are even transporting migrants to Agadez, and then making sure that they get on vehicles that takes them to Libya. So it means that they're trying to create an increase. They're trying to create an increase in terms of people who are going to Europe, illegally, so to speak. And that is
And that's to destabilize, I imagine, the European politics.
Exactly. The idea is also to create a crisis in the borders of Europe. So I'm going to look at these issues, deeply. And I'm also going to continue to investigate the military operations by Russia in communities where no one has talked about. Yeah.
That's incredibly powerful. I strongly recommend people to follow your work, and it sounds like you're going in an incredibly important direction, and one which is driving a move towards right-wing, dangerous extremist politics in Europe. We can see Russia's hand behind that in many ways. It's incredibly important.
Yeah, and that's why we created a GoFundMe, campaign, just to be able to assist us in this investigation. Yeah, so I'll be grateful if people can contribute, can donate, can support in whatever way that they can. Yeah.
It's incredibly important, and they'll see the evidence of where that money goes in the extraordinary reporting, and quite unique, because if you weren't doing this, I think a lot of these issues wouldn't get any coverage at all. Philip, it's been such a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm in awe of the work you do. I'm so glad you made the time to speak to the audience. Thanks so much for coming on the channel.
The pleasure is mine, Jonathan. Thank you for having me.